Welcome to How to Yu-Gi-Oh!
Historic Archetype, Gishki.
Chapter 1.
So, in this historic archetype video, I'm going to be talking about Gishki, the impact it's had on Yu-Gi-Oh! And how it has shaped what I feel hand looping has become in Yu-Gi-Oh! And one of the first very torturous hand loops to play around. With that being said, let's get on with the rest of the video.
Chapter 2.
Here it is. The two monsters that created the hand loop, the most famous hand loop in Yu-Gi-Oh history, the Gishki hand loop. First starting with Gust Kraken and Mind August. You have to remember at this time, when the time these were released, Effect Veiler wasn't released yet. The only hand trap we had at that point in time was DDD Crow, which was released during the GX era or during that time. Hand traps, the concept of hand traps did not exist in the Synchro era before we go to the XYZ era. The point is that the aspect of a competitive hand loop or just hand looping your opponent and removing their hand straight away was something that did not exist. We did have Yatagarasu when the game first started in the early days, but again, that was due to a spirit monster, and then again, that was due to broken effects and due to not really broken effects, I can say, but effects that were very, very slow. But with the Gishki rituals, as you can see with Gust Kraken, which, as you can see there, when it is, ritual summon, whatever it is, you can shuffle two cards randomly from your opponent's hand into the deck, and August keep reshuffling to draw cards, whatever it is. The point is that this hand loop was possible. These, at the time of their release, were at 3 a copy, and this hand loop was severely damaging. It was completely unplayable at the time to play around this loop because you have to remember again we had no hand traps. So this was completely impossible to stop. You couldn't stop this hand loop, and as a result, this was the first time the Konami witnessed such a disgusting, in the competitive scene anyway, such a disgusting hand loop that after doing some time, their cards got limited to one, and I think that's where they've been. And then a few years ago, we unlimited the Gishki cards, and they're now back at full power. But at the time of their unlimits, obviously, hand traps are in the game, so doing the Gishki loop now is completely pointless. And Gishki have had support during that time, but again, doing or attempting a Gishki loop is completely, utterly pointless nowadays. So, what does Gishki have to do with Yu-Gi-Oh! And why is it historic? Well, it's historic because it is the first competitive hand loop that Yu-Gi-Oh's ever had. So it has that significance. It has that power over the game. And anyone who played Yu-Gi-Oh! During this format, or anyone who was witness to this disgusting hand loop, realizes how powerful it was, how there was no way to stop it, and how it was completely and utterly broken for the time. Sure, we did have obviously ice barriers that came in, but the difference is the ice barrier was limited. The ice barrier, Trish, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, was limited, it was Synchro 9, but it was extremely hard to make multiple Trish. It wasn't easy. Trish wasn't something you could just make consistently. It was a Synchro 9 that needed +2 materials. Very, very hard to make. To make three of them, to make one of them, sure. To make three of them in the same turn, to hand loop your opponent for what? For only 3 cards? I mean, I guess, but it wasn't that easy. It was a very skillful thing to do. The point I'm trying to make here is that Gishki made history. And in the annals of Yu Gi Oh! History, we should never forget hand looping, where it started, where it came from, and Gishki is the introduction of hand loops into Yu-Gi-Oh!
Final chapter.
And here we'll go with the overall conclusion. So, what have I got to say here? All I've got to say is that Gishki is the first step or the first outings of hand looping in Yu-Gi-Oh! Introduced to the wide audience, especially for competitive players and for just anyone in general who played Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time. Did we have hand loops before? Yes, when the game first started. But the Yatagarasu hand loop is completely different and doesn't really count as a hand loop, as you would use so many cards to facilitate that hand loop. You had Chaos Emperor Dragon, you had Battle Traps, there was so many things. The stars had to align to facilitate the Yatagarasu hand loop. Whereas the Gishki hand loop was the first time where you as a player facilitated this hand loop. We introduced archetype consistency, as we could search these cards which could facilitate this hand loop much more readily and effectively. It was no longer guesswork, it was now I can initiate this hand loop, I can do it all the time, every time, as long as my effects don't get negated. The game was that fast, but it wasn't fast enough for us to have hand traps at the time. Got to remember the amount of hand traps we had at the time was only DDD Crow and Karibo. So there was no Effect Veiler. Effect Veiler is a very recent invention at that time, and it didn't really exist. I think it was only the year after Gishki were released was when Effect Veiler was introduced and released into the game. So it didn't even exist. One of the most influential hand traps didn't exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! At this point. So stopping that combo was completely and utterly pointless. And well, that's it. That's all I've got to say about this historic archetype. Tune in next time as we'll talk more about other historic archetypes and their relevance to Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Hope to see you soon.
We come to the end of this video. So, as I like to say, you are one step closer to becoming a Yu-Gi-Oh! Master. My fate, right, is in your hands.